I'm Michael. Hi, everybody. I'm here from France. Today we're going to have three talks. I'll talk first about the process of dating two documents, which will take 20 minutes. Next, we're going to have Tatsuro Ide from Japan, who's going to talk to us a bit about reconsidering the passivity of Miller's narrator, in specifically the Rosy Crucifixion, which I'm always very happy to hear more people talk about the crucifixion. And then Cheyenne Gustafson, who's going to discuss the influence of Miller on the modern romance novel, which I don't think we've heard about before. Does this work? Good. And thanks, Bill. I've had a really, really wonderful weekend. I didn't know what to expect, though I was somewhat involved on the peripheries of the planning, but I've had such a great time. So my research over the past several years has focused on the evolution of Henry Miller's writing methods, how he planned, drafted, and revised his work, specifically the Rosy Crucifixion trilogy. To do this, I've relied primarily on the tools of what the French call genetic criticism. This field uses pre-publication documents, notes, sketches, outlines, corrected drafts, proofs, any scrap of paper that testifies to the journey from idea to published book in order to reconstruct and interpret a writing process. But to do this, it is first necessary to establish the chronology of the writings under consideration. This preliminary work can be long, arduous, and at times a frustrating task, but without it, it is impossible to understand Miller's writing life. The central reason we are gathered here today, after all, is because of the time Miller spent writing. As Jean-Yves Tadier observes in his biography of Marcel Proust, if the history of the work itself is not related, the story of the author and the process of writing it, how many hours, days, and years in the life of the artist are overlooked? It may not be the most fascinating account to write, yet it is the most important aspect to know. I believe personally that rigorous scholarship on Miller's work and life will benefit from a shared understanding of which materials Miller had access to at different points in his career. So the purpose of my talk today is simply to set the historical record straight about one of the most important documents in his archive, the Capricorn Notes, and to excavate a crucial turning point in the genesis of his most ambitious work, the Rosy Crucifixion. So Miller, as we all know, always maintained that there was just one book he had truly wanted to write, the story of his relationship with his second wife, June Edith Smith. Over time, this story evolved into a kind of Proustian saga charting the genesis of a writer in 1920s New York. To many of Miller's readers, the inception of this one book is very well known. In the spring of 1927, June and her friend, a woman Miller calls Jean Kronsky, temporarily abandoned Miller in New York and traveled to Paris. In a state of extreme distress, Miller created an outline for a novel about his life with June. Miller's use of this outline would span every major phase of his career, from the posthumously published Crazy Cock, initially drafted in 1929, to the Rosy Crucifixion trilogy, written between 1940 and 1959. The outline thus offers an unparalleled glimpse into the development of Miller's method of turning life into art. Yet a number of basic questions surrounding it have never been explicitly addressed. How many versions and copies were created, and when? Does the first version still exist? And if so, where is it? Now, because of competitive acquisition policies in special collections libraries, as well as Miller's own efforts during his lifetime to sell manuscript material, the Miller Archive is today dispersed across a significant geographical area, mainly in the United States. Over the course of my research, I visited roughly 20 public and private repositories and consulted materials in more than 40 collections. Only by bringing together documents from these distant sites was it possible to piece together the story of Miller's outline and correct whatever confusion has persisted for decades. This dispersal remains a major obstacle to the kind of documentary work I am advocating, and it's worth acknowledging that such research would have been impossible without the support of generous institutional grants. It's also worth pointing out the significant advantage afforded to today's archival researchers by the evolution of both technology and archival access policies. Mary Dearborn spoke on the first evening about her methodology when she was researching her biography of Miller. the Xeroxes she had to order, using a card catalog. It's only in the past 20 years or so that archives have begun to allow personal cameras in, and then in that same time frame, mobile digital scanner applications have become the norm. So today, I walk into an archive and I spend my entire 8 hours simply photographing documents. And on my portable hard drive, I have a complete record with optical character recognition automatically integrated, which I can carry around and search and cross-reference at any time. So it's a completely different process from what Mary would have been working with in the late 80s and early 90s. So after 5 years of investigation, the answers to the questions that I posed turned out to be fairly straightforward. 2 distinct versions of the outline survive. The first, on the left, Plan of Novel, June, is a 58-page set of typed and handwritten notes bound in red marbled boards. Among them is the original 26-page outline Miller wrote in 1927 when June left for Paris. It is housed today at the Albert and Shirley Small Special Collections Library at the University of Virginia. The second, on the right, Capricorn Notes, the much better-known document, consists of 30 loose typewritten sheets. Produced between the summer of 1939 and the spring of 1940, it is a retyped and substantially revised version of the earlier plan. It now forms part of the Karpelis Manuscript Library's private collections in Santa Barbara. A copy of that document, a photostat copy, was published in the 14th volume of Nexus a couple years ago. So a few scholars over the past 44 decades have recognized that Capricorn Notes represents a later document, but not how fully it reworked the original. The original, meanwhile, has long been presumed lost. There isn't time today to walk through every step of my 5-year investigation into these 2 documents, nor to discuss the particulars of how Miller went about transforming one into the other. Instead, I'll summarize a few of their most important differences and explain briefly how I was able to establish their chronology. When I first examined Capricorn Notes, one of the first things I noticed was that it contains references not only to Miller's later years in Paris, such as the title, The Rosy Crucifixion, but also to his time in Greece. And those are what is crossed out in the 2 lower excerpts from Capricorn Notes. Clear evidence that the document could not have been written before the summer of 1939, when Miller went to Greece for the first time, only time. Reading both outlines side by side, I saw that Capricorn Notes expanded the main biographical narrative and plan of novel by about 30%. On the screen here is one example of how Miller amplified a specific incident during the rewrite. He roughly tripled the number of words used to describe his and June's move to their glorious Remsen Street apartment, an episode later novelized in the opening pages of Plexus. If we zoom out and consider a whole page of the outline, these annotated transcriptions show, at a glance, how the material evolved during the rewrite. Plan of Novel, June, is on the left, and Capricorn Notes is on the right. Material deleted from the earlier Plan of Novel I've highlighted in red, while material newly added to Capricorn Notes is shown in bold type. I've also assigned numbers to each paragraph to better visualize how Miller reordered incidents as he rewrote. So I know there's a lot of detail on this slide, and later if anyone would like copies of these annotated transcriptions, let me know. I'd be happy to send them to you. I've completed the first 5 of the 23 pages, which corresponds roughly to sexes. So overall, the language and sequence of events in these 2 documents are similar enough to suggest that not only was Plan of Novel the earlier of the 2 documents, but that Miller used it as the base text when composing Capricorn Notes. This relationship was confirmed when I saw that passages Miller had marked for relocation in the earlier Plan of Novel appear precisely where he indicated in the later Capricorn Notes. For example, here you can see that Miller wanted to move an anecdote appearing on page 4 of Plan of Novel, which I've labeled C, to page 1, between 2 other paragraphs, A and B. And below, we see that in Capricorn Notes, this is exactly where it appears. The chronology that I was beginning to establish was also supported by larger structural differences between the 2 documents. The earlier plan of novel is divided into 8 titled chapters, whose names appear at the top of every page. The later Capricorn Notes, on the other hand, does not contain these titled chapter divisions. Instead, it's divided into 9 untitled sections, each separated by a line centered on the page. These 9 sections roughly correspond to Plan of Novel's 8 chapters. Miller did, however, preserve a record of those chapter titles in Capricorn Notes, but they appear on a separate page under the heading Original Chapter Divisions, which is on the right. So structurally then, Plan of Novel is a more conventional outline for a novel. Plan of Novel, June, is a more conventional outline for a novel, and reflects Miller's earlier efforts to tell the story of his life in Crazy Cock before he pursued more experimental narrative forms in Tropic of Capricorn and the Rosy Crucifixion. By contrast, Capricorn Notes is a looser document. It preserves and expands the biographical outline, but does away with the more rigid structural framework, allowing Miller to follow the sequence of events while simultaneously leaving him freer to discover a larger structure as he writes. I'd like to pause here in my chronology to point out something about the structure of the Rosy Crucifixion. Many critics have faulted the work for what they see as its more conventional chapter divisions. But there are 2 issues here that genetic analysis helps to clarify. First, despite how some publishers have chosen to format current editions of the text, the Rosy Crucifixion does not actually contain chapters. It contains what Miller called sections. He was explicit about this in his instructions to his publisher, Maurice Girodias, on how Sextus should be laid out. He told Girodias to number the book's 23 sections in large Arabic numerals with generous space between. Don't make a new page for a new section as you would ordinarily with chapter divisions. I prefer to keep it compact. The second issue with this claim of conventionality is that Miller drafted all of Sextus and most of Plexus as a continuous, undivided text. The decision to add numbered sections came only later. And so on the left, you can see the original typescript for Sextus, and that Roman numeral in this case, it was Arabic in the published text, which he specified, that it's simply a paragraph break, the same kind of break that would be between any other paragraph in the novel. It's only later, and it happens to be one of the last phases of revision, the introduction of numbered sections. But incidentally, Finn Jensen spoke about the connections between Louis Ferdinand Céline and Miller yesterday. The idea for presenting the crucifixion in this way, as we see on the right, with the space and then Arabic numeral, came from his reading of the first English translation of Céline's Death on the Installment Plan, which he completed at the end of 1942 when he had just arrived in Beverly Glen. The first translation, Céline's original isn't laid out that way, and the current editions of the English translation aren't either. It's just a straight text with a few paragraph breaks. But for whatever reason, when New Directions first published Céline's novel, Death on the Installment Plan, they chose to break it up like that. And Miller made a note to divide his text in a similar manner way back in 1941, or January 42, pardon me, he made the decision. All right, so I'll get back to my chronology. At this point, I felt confident that Plan of Novel was both the earlier document and the base text for the revised Capricorn Notes. Yet one detail prevented me from accepting Plan of Novel as the original 1927 outline, a headnote at the top of the first page of Capricorn Notes. It reads, originally compiled in space of 24 hours hand running at the office of the Park Commissioner, Queens County, 1927, while June was in Europe with her friend Jean Kronsky. And this last sentence is the important part. Copy of original given to Bertha Schrank when in Paris, 1932 or 33. Initially, and as other researchers have invariably assumed, I took this to mean that Miller was identifying Capricorn Notes itself as the copy of the original document. If that were the case, this suggested that the 1927 original, given to Schrank, was lost. But if that were so, then Miller's language here puzzled me. When in Paris, 1932 or 33 suggests both a geographical and a temporal distance. If he had created this document while still in Paris, he would not have written when in Paris. And the uncertainty of 32 or 33 implies that enough time had passed for him to no longer remember exactly when he gave the original to Schrank. More puzzling still, how could Capricorn Notes be a copy of the original if Miller no longer had the original to copy from? I already knew from its references to Corfu that Capricorn Notes had been written sometime after the summer of 1939, long after the supposed original had been given to Schrank. It didn't make sense. Then one morning, after rereading the head note for the umpteenth time, I realized my mistake. The copy in the phrase copy of original given to Bertha Schrank does not refer to Capricorn Notes itself, but to the document that had been given to Schrank. In other words, Miller had given Schrank a carbon copy of the outline's original typescript and kept the original for himself. With this new reading, Plan of Novel June suddenly emerged as a very strong candidate for the original 1927 outline. My new reading of the head note was confirmed when I examined the Plan of Novel notebook in person at the University of Virginia. On its front flyleaf, there are 3 lines of text that Miller heavily crossed out, which are, in the red box there. It was impossible to decipher the text in the digital copy the university had sent me before my visit, but even when I examined the document in person, it remained unreadable to the naked eye. So I took about a dozen close-up photos in different lighting, just with an iPad, and after several weeks of coming back to the text with fresh eyes every few days, I was able to piece together the text word by word. And this is where I was talking to Stephen about how he's able to fluidly read Anais Nin's handwriting, which is impenetrable to me, and he had difficulty with some of Miller's. I think it took a deep familiarity with Miller's handwriting at this particular period of his life to be able to get these words. So the text reads, an exact duplicate of these notes was given to Bertha Schrank in Paris, 1932. She is wife of Joseph Schrank, American playwright. So this resolved the problem of the head note. Schrank had received an exact copy of Plan of Novel. Miller had kept the original and had used it later as a base text for Capricorn Notes. Further evidence came from acquisition records and correspondence that I uncovered in the weeks and months that followed. So I should mention here that I got lucky. Library staff at the University of Virginia was kind enough to let me consult the control folders for their Miller materials, files containing administrative information related to library acquisitions. Access to these administrative records is not always granted, and I've since been turned down at other institutions. So here you can see the University of Virginia's acquisition record for Plan of Novel June. In the middle of the page, it notes that the notebook was purchased for $500 from a man named Barnett B. Reuter on June 6, 1961. Many of us will recognize Reuter as the bookseller who, among other things, upon Miller's return to New York in 1940, provided him with funds to support his parents and sister. So it seemed clear that Miller must have given Reuter Plan of Novel as a gesture of gratitude. The scenario was later confirmed by correspondence I came across. I'll cite just the most revealing of these letters, though there are many in which, there's about 3 in which this comes up. This one is addressed to the merchant seaman and aspiring writer, Harry Hershkowitz, who incidentally Mary Dearborn also spoke about, and I would agree that they are by far the most disturbing letters that I've ever come across in the tens of thousands of letters Miller wrote. It's dated April 1944, and by this time it seems Miller regretted giving Reuter his original outline. And if ever in your rambles you run across a man named Barnett B. Reuter, formerly a rare book dealer, I want you to worm your way into his good graces and steal 2 things from him. 1, a bound leather notebook of Capricorn, which I gave him, and 2, whatever watercolors of mine he may have. He shouldn't have them, especially not that notebook. The bound leather notebook, I now knew, was Plan of Novel June at the University of Virginia. This letter also reveals more information about the copy given to Schrank. For the record, I will tell you that one other person has a carbon copy of this unbound, or did have. I gave it to her in Paris in a drunken moment. Bertha Schrank, wife of the movie writer Joseph Schrank. You can steal that too if you ever get the chance. So besides confirming that Schrank's exact duplicate was a carbon copy rather than a retype, this 1944 letter to Hershkowitz suggests that no additional copies of the original 1927 outline were ever produced. It also provides a valuable lead to any future archival excavators. If Schrank's carbon copy ever resurfaces, it will likely be unbound. So with that, I had a complete timeline for both Plan of Novel June and Capricorn Notes. The summary I'll give here includes one additional step I haven't had time to go in to describe in detail concerning the creation of photostat copies of Capricorn Notes. So Miller wrote the Plan of Novel outline in the summer of 1927, making 1 carbon copy. He gave Schrank that carbon in 1932 to 33, whose whereabouts remain unknown. Sometime between the summer of 1939 and the spring of 1940, just before beginning work on the Rosy Crucifixion, Miller transformed plan of novel into Capricorn Notes and gave the original plan of novel notebook to Barnett Reuter. In 1946, Miller asked his friend Herbert West, a professor at Dartmouth College, to make copies of Capricorn Notes so that he didn't have to worry about losing his only copy, the original of Capricorn Notes. West made at least 4 photostat copies, 1 negative, 3 positive, which are today housed in special and private collections. Finally, Reuter sold plan of novel to the University of Virginia in 1961, and the Capricorn Notes manuscript passed to the Karpeles Library in Santa Barbara in 97. And this is my last slide, Bill, the conclusion. So having established the chronology, you might be wondering, now what? So one question that comes to mind is, why did Miller feel compelled to completely rewrite the foundational outline on the eve of starting work on the Rosy Crucifixion? And for a man who seemed to hold nothing back in his thousands of letters, why is there no mention of this crucial event in any of them? These are questions for future biographers. My more limited point here is that without rigorous attention to the documentary record, they are questions we would have never even known to ask. What I think is lacking in our understanding, of Miller and his work in the story, what is lacking in our understanding of Miller and his work is the story of Miller at work. That is, detailed reconstructions of his actual working methods during the stages of planning, drafting, and revision. Knowledge of a text's history can enrich both our reading of the published work and our understanding of the writer's life. Miller once wrote in Tropic of Capricorn that confusion is a word we've invented for an order which is not understood. In the dense field of his notes, drafts, and revisions that survive, there is an objective order to every word that was put down, and by reconstructing that order, new interpretive possibilities emerge. Miller thematized his own writing process perhaps more than any other 20th century author. But if we want to understand Miller's artistic practice, we cannot rely on the published text alone. The truth they convey is experiential, not historical, and from a scholarly standpoint, it remains at best a partial account. Last point. As the genetic critic Louis Hay reminds us, the process of writing cannot be conjectured by studying the text to which it nevertheless gave birth. The trip backwards from the text to the manuscript is full of discoveries and often astonishment. Once expectations are foiled, the process of writing is of a different nature than the written word. And so what began as a question of chronology has turned into something larger, an attempt to map the living processes by which Miller transformed experience into art, and to infer from those processes the rhythms of Miller's mind at work. Thank you, guys.